Hi, this is Paul, and today I have with me Sam Stuckless, who I first became acquainted with when I don't remember who sent this to me anymore, but someone sent me a Substack that he wrote in July called The Limits of Evangelical Ecumenism, which I thought was an interesting piece. And then, I don't know, you reached out. I posted it on Twitter perhaps, and you reached out to me, and that's how we're here. Is that sort of the way it goes?
Sort of. I think you had mentioned that Paul and Leitner, hope I'm saying that right, had sent it
Oh,
to you.
yeah, that
And
could very well be.
yeah, and I saw that you had subscribed.
Yeah.
So I was a fan of your videos. I watch them pretty frequently. So I thought I'd reach out because I've been, yeah, really looking forward to this conversation for a while.
Okay. Well, let's start with you. Well, tell me about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a Protestant turned Catholic convert. That's fairly recently, but that process I would say took about 10 years. I was attending a non-denominational church in the C3 movement. That's kind of like a Hillsong Light type of church planting movement based in Australia, but they've got churches worldwide. They've got a big church in Toronto here, I'm in Canada. So they have a pretty big church in Toronto. We were affiliated with them, pretty connected with that Toronto branch. I live in Kitchener-Waterloo, and so we were kind of this Kitchener-Waterloo chapter of it. I'd say around the pandemic, though, our pastor had started to have a bit of a theological journey. He started going on a bit of a theological journey. He was always really a little more deep into um, church history and deeper stuff than your average charismatic Pentecostal typically would be. And I think with the pandemic and that breaking apart the embodiment of church, where it's all digital, it's all just this info out kind of experience, he was really kind of hit with an existential crisis of what does church mean, and so he kind of let me in on that, and that kind of reopened some of the questions I'd had. I had gone to a Catholic university, and I
Well,
actually was
let's back up and let's do
yeah.
the
Let's
full
back up.
rando
Sure.
thing. What? Tell me about the home you grew up in. What was? Did your parents go to church?
Oh man, okay. So this could be really long if we go to my full life, but I actually my earliest memories were on a commune. I lived in this kind of Anabaptist commune around the time I was 3 to 4. I think my parents had moved us there when I was probably
Yeah.
about
See, this
2.
is the stuff we like.
This is
Keep
the stuff we
going.
like. All right, yeah. So there's a lot. Yeah. So I mean, that was my earliest memories of religion was living
Hmm.
on this kind of Hutterite-ish commune outside of Kitchener, Ontario, and which is weird because you kind of your first memories are being sort of apart from the world in this secluded, strict thing where your parents don't really own anything. Like you're kind of moving
Well,
to
let's
different.
back up into your parents' story now, because
uh,
because some people wind up on these things because they're raised in them, but it sounds like your parents chose this.
Okay, if you want to go back further, that gets even more complicated. So my mom was a Roman Catholic. She converted to she got saved at a Darien Lake, Kingdom Bound, I want to say, if people know about that. It's this
Somebody
big
will.
Pentecostal music festival that I don't know if they do them anymore, but it would have been in the late 80s. And then my dad was a missionary kid. His parents were in Assemblies of God. So these two worlds are kind of always speaking into my life a little bit, the Pentecostal world and the Catholic world. Um, so that's my parents. My mom got baptized again as an adult. They met, they got married. I know there was drama in her family
How'd
with
they meet?
my grandparents met her at church and brought her home to see my dad. So yeah,
Ah, church.
yeah. I mean, that's the best way to meet your spouse. I met my wife at church. So,
All
but
right. So she grows up Roman Catholic,
yeah,
has an experience, gets rebaptized,
yeah,
goes Pentecostal. Your husband is or your father's raised Pentecostal. They get set up because the grandparents find her in church. Oh, she's a nice young girl. We've got a nice young grandson. Bang, they
yeah.
get married. What kind of work does your father do?
He was a teacher.
Okay.
Yeah, and then my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She did some like side part-time jobs on the side, but mostly stayed home and raised us.
So how do they wind up among the Hutterite-ish?
Yeah, that commune's interesting because I think it started. This guy went out and was trying to, be the Acts Church, and he lived among the Hutterites for a while, and then he came back from out west, and he started this commune outside of Kitchener, Ontario. And so my dad, I think, had discovered this because you have kids. I've experienced now at my point. I have two sons of my own. They're both under two, and there's a certain conservative streak, protective streak that hits you when you have kids and you
Yeah,
want to pass on your values to them.
yeah.
So he, I think, felt something like that, and he's like, I think the world is going to hell. He could kind of see it then in the 90s. Uh, I want to raise my kids and protect them and bring them up in the faith. And so he starts going to this church because you could go and not be a part of the commune. You could go and attend it. He likes it because they're doing communion every Sunday. The preaching is, he likes the preaching. He likes the music. It's all hymns and it's not this contemporary rock music. He might like he's got a ton of aversion to the whole Pentecostal thing, having grown up in it. In a lot of ways, we just react to what our parents did. And to an extent, that's true of my story.
Sure.
Um, so he has a Pentecostal upbringing, but he's definitely doing things deliberately to be different from that. So they end up there. Again, we're there from probably around the time I'm 2 to 5, so my earliest memories are there. Um, some things happened, some difficult things happened as they tend to. This community, by the way, no longer exists, at least not in that form. I don't think it's existed for over 10 years now, maybe even 15, 20. Um, a lot of the thing with these types of communities is you have to always be recruiting new families, because at a certain point you get 5 families and they've all married each other, so they can't reproduce themselves and they do die out. um, so we ended up moving to a native reserve because he had been a teacher. He left his public school job to teach at the commune, and then he needs to find a new job, and the only place that'll take him at that time is this native reserve. And so we go live up there for a year. We're not going to church because there's no church on the reserve. And I think they needed some time to kind of heal. My dad calls that experience his halfway house back into the real world. And then we moved to Southern Ontario after about a year after that. My parents had saved enough money to buy a house. And so we go to this small town in kind of rural Ontario, and we started going to a Baptist church shortly after that. And we were there for a couple years. I think we went most Sundays, if not every Sunday. And there eventually, as Baptist churches often do, there was a church split. And after that happened, we kind of permanently stopped going to church. We would do like Sunday devotional together. So we'd sing some hymns, read some Bible, pray, and that just as a family.
Yeah.
And so that was my whole experience of church, basically up until the time I left the house. I did go to some Pentecostal youth groups, one of which was led by Nathan Finocchio, who I wrote about in my article.
Hmm.
I had a really good time at that youth group. It was a lot of fun. It was exactly what a youth group should be.
Hmm.
The teenage years are a weird time in anybody's life. That's where a lot of people do fall away from the faith. And when you have that kind of an anchor, even if you're not personally very devout, it does keep you kind of tethered and keeps God in the back of your mind,
Hmm.
even as you're getting drunk on weekends sometimes with your high school friends. So I am grateful to have had access to that because I think it did sustain me in some ways as a teenager.
You went to public school?
I went to public school. Yeah, my dad was actually my teacher one year, as well as my sports coach. So you know that's a fun dynamic.
All right. So college, what do you do for college?
Yeah, so I went to U Waterloo. I took a degree in kind of like digital design and tech, which is the industry I work in now. But I was at a Roman Catholic university. at the University of Waterloo. Some universities kind of have these colleges because universities are usually founded by church schools, and so this was one of the colleges that had founded the University of Waterloo. And that was where I really like entertained Catholicism for the first time. I had made a friend who was a pretty devout Catholic, still is a pretty devout Catholic. He was actually my RCIA sponsor, and he was the godfather for both my boys. And it was the first time I'd really considered it as an option. I'm thinking about, okay, if I'm going to live my faith out as an adult, what's that going to look like? Because I'm not tied to any particular church. I've experienced a few different flavors, Pentecostal youth group and Baptist church and Hutterite commune, and I need a way forward. I need to pick the best one. And what appealed to me about the Catholic Church at that time was it seemed like they had not wavered at all on their moral teaching. And I think that's still one of the things that drew me to them as an adult.
When you say the Catholic Church hasn't wavered at all on its moral teaching, what do you mean by the Catholic Church?
I mean specifically like the written, like what the Catechism teaches, what
Okay.
canon law teaches. I
Okay.
know that of course there are popes with maybe ambiguous language on certain moral teachings,
Yeah.
certain social issues.
Yeah.
But I mean that the list of sins that you have to confess in the confession booth is the same.
Okay.
That's not changing. Whereas, I think some of this stuff came to a head because I had people in my family who were getting divorced and
Mm-hmm.
remarried as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
I had always thought that was not a thing you were allowed to do. Turns out there's a fair bit of leeway on that in some streams of evangelicalism,
Mm-hmm.
certainly the main lines,
Mm-hmm.
and that was confusing to me. And so I thought, well, if I have to live a Christian lifestyle, I think it's helpful if I'm confident that my lifestyle choices are lining up with the truth, with God's law. At the end of the day, it's God's opinion that counts, not my particular interpretation of it. So that again, the people have different reasons for being drawn in, but that was probably my main one at first. Yeah, I ultimately didn't convert at that time. Did face a fair bit of pushback from my family, and frankly, I wasn't informed enough on some of the difficult hurdles that any Protestant becoming Catholic has to face, and things like Mary, things like praying to the saints, indulgences, which are still things that even having converted, like you're still rubbing up against your Protestant instincts, which are they run very deep. And at the time, yeah, I just didn't have the intellectual uh, knowledge. I didn't have the background on these things to even decide if they were true or not.
Now, were your mother's parents, are they still alive? Are they still Catholic?
Yeah, so my grandpa is still alive. He lives in a retirement community,
Okay.
retirement village at this point. So I don't think he gets out to church very much anymore.
Okay.
But my grandma, I know my grandma was very devout to the end,
Yeah.
but she did pass away about 8 years ago. Um, and she was definitely the most devout
Yeah.
example that I had in my life of Catholic piety. But
Because
um,
sometimes these things, sometimes someone who converts to something will be very zealous for it. Someone who leaves it sometimes will be like, fine, I just left it. Or sometimes they'll be like, oh, I'm never going back to that. So when you say you got a little bit of pushback from your family, I mean, you do have family members that are at one level or another, at least associated or participating within the Catholic Church.
Right. Yeah, the pushback would have come more from like my parents,
Yeah,
particularly my dad and my grandparents as well. My
yeah,
grandparents were actually, for Pentecostal missionaries, especially missionaries in primarily Catholic countries,
hmm
like Spain,
yeah,
Costa Rica.
yeah,
They they've had a lot of Catholic friends.
yeah,
They don't have this idea that Catholics are outside of God's plan of salvation. One of their
yeah.
closest friends was a Catholic priest. But of course, they have their suspicions, and there's a reason that they weren't Catholic, and they had seen a
Yeah.
lot of the maybe damage that comes from a lukewarm cultural Catholicism,
Yeah.
and so I totally understood that, and but it
Yeah.
yeah, for my dad, I think he liked Martin Luther. He wrote a lot of papers about Martin Luther in school because he went to a Christian college, and I think he had a minor in theology. Um, so that was a lot. There's a lot of conversation with him, and he was definitely not pleased. At the same time, I got a text one day, and I hadn't been baptized yet, and they told me your grandpa would love to baptize you, and at that point, I was like, okay, well, I'm already on the fence. Like, I don't have a great reason to push back against my family here. So I'm gonna sit tight. I'll let my grandpa baptize me, and we'll go from there. And then after I graduated, I ended up joining this church, this evangelical church plant, and being a part of it for the next about 8 years.
Where did you meet your wife?
So we met at well, we met at church, and then we got to know each other kind of in some informal hangouts outside of church, and that would have been in 2019. We got married in 2020, about a year and a half after we met.
When in 2020?
Before the or sorry after the pandemic. After the
Oh.
pandemic, we got engaged before and married in the summer. We actually had to move our date. We moved our date up because we were bored. We were living at my parents' house in separate bedrooms, of course. Um, but we were just staying with my parents, kind of hoping it would blow over. And when it turned out it was not going to blow over, we decided to move our wedding up and just get on with life.
Okay, what
So
kind of wedding did you do in the middle of the pandemic?
we rented a very small little art studio and live streamed it and had about 20 family members there,
Okay.
and that was it. Yeah, it
Okay.
was a lot smaller than our initial plan.
Oh, the pandemic was weird.
On the positive side, it only cost us, a few $1,000s to do the wedding.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah.
we saved a lot of money.
Didn't have to feed a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
Oh, I totally get that. So when did you decide? Well, tell me more because the angle and in the how can I say this? Journeys in pastors' lives impact their churches, and that will be more so, generally speaking, especially in church plants. I think, especially in Protestant churches, although Catholic churches, I mean, you look at guys like Richard Rohr, has had a big impact. Um, but it's a funny business being a pastor because pastors, of course, usually get into the ministry because they're motivated, they're sincere, they very much want to participate and lead, but that motivation, sincerity, seeking aspect, sort of intensification aspect can, especially right now, lead in different ways when, I've used this word metagelical, where sort of the walls between all of the traditions either are getting lower or the water's getting higher. And so you've got a lot of people who are sort of hopping out of one pond and into another pond. And so if you have a pastor of an evangelical church who's, and you can see this with, I mean, some of the people you mentioned, this is why, I had a lot of thoughts about your article. I, they had a lot of thoughts about your article a few months ago. I don't know how many of the thoughts I can pull up again. But, you look at someone like John Mark Comer, who in some ways is retreading a bunch of the stuff that I knew in the 90s and aughts with Dallas Willard. I was just recently at a church in North Carolina. It was very interesting when the pastor quoted both Dallas Willard and John Mark Comer. And, as you go into churches and you're just looking for signs of, okay, where's this pastor feeding, and where might that take him? And then you've got, Gavin Ortland, who's out there sort of as a winsome, but yet, I mean, Gavin Ortland's mission seems to be to sort of continue to carry water for um, Reformed Baptists. And the other guys I didn't know as well. But part of what caught my eye also, because obviously in my space I've had a lot of people go Orthodox, some have gone traditional Catholic, some have sort of burrowed deeper in. But part of what's going on with Protestant churches is that you don't quite know what you're going to find when you go into a Protestant church. And a lot of that depends on, well, who's the pastor been reading? And what's that pastor's trajectory? And again, especially in a church plant, a non-denominational church plant, the churches just kind of follow the pastor or some of the strong leaders that are in the church, and the sheep are going to sort of go along with, to the degree that the sheep are like, well, I like the music, I like the preaching, I like him. It's right down the street. The kids like it, the wife likes it. Good enough for me. So,
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, to that last point, like leaving our church that I'd been part of for 8 years was like one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life.
I believe it.
It's very disorienting. It's isolating and lonely. That's what it feels like. Even if you stay friends with all of the people that you were at church with, it's like where I'm not seeing you every Sunday now, and now I have to go be part of this new church. And Catholics are not traditionally as warm and welcoming as your sign holding evangelical churches with the flags out front. So that was a tough thing to do, and I understand why people are reluctant to leave. You know, Even if maybe they have some gripes with the pastor's theological bent. There's more reasons to stay than to leave in
Well,
most
tell me a little
cases.
bit about the pastor's journey. Now, he's not here, so I understand you have to be circumspect, but
Yeah,
tell me
well,
about
he's my
how
friend.
okay, well, tell me
Yeah.
about the pastor's journey, where that's led him at least so far, and how that impacted you.
Yeah, so he was again focused really on how does the church embody itself, and that led him to read a lot of the church fathers, particularly in the first 500 years. I know he's real big on John Chrysostom. I think he's probably read most of what that guy's written at this point, and he would frequently reference him in his sermons. And I think he uncovered that the Eucharist is this centrally important thing. He came to the conviction that churches should have bishops.
Hmm.
Um, so there's another bunch of other things I could name, but basically what happened was he kind of hit a wall at a certain point where he felt he could no longer be part of the C3 movement. Like he couldn't be part of that church planning network. He had to join the ACNA. So that church that I was previously going to actually became part of the Anglican Church of North America. For those who don't know what that is, it's a conservative breakaway movement of the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church of Canada. And that's actually it's very interesting that they just recently joined that, given all that's happened in the Anglican world. I do wonder if those churches, yeah, I don't know what that looks like now because they were attending GAFCON, and anyway, whole other topic. But they became Anglican. He they I guess with the Anglicans they really value the first seven ecumenical councils. They're trying to hold together what did the church always believe, but they have some Protestant distinctives too. The Bible alone kind of is still the ultimate source of authority, and you'll get honestly a variety of opinions on what Anglicanism truly is, depending on who you ask.
Yeah.
So that's where they ended up, and but in
So the
that
whole
process,
church went ACNA.
the whole church went ACNA. Caveat that, like I
Yeah.
know several families did leave in that
How big
process.
was the church?
At our peak, we were like pulling 120 adults on a Sunday.
Okay,
I
so
think after the pandemic, it went down a bit
yeah.
because
Well,
people.
we also have to remember we're talking Canada here, and I'm not saying,
Yeah,
I mean, Canadian evangelical churches tend to be quite a bit smaller than
yeah,
those south of the border.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we were not a big church, but uh we had outlasted the average church plant certainly, and I think
Hmm.
we were above average for a church plant, I'd say,
Yeah.
in Canada. Um, but yeah, they so several families did leave. I know some families have joined since though, and are very attracted to what's going on there. Like they're that is another consequence of maybe some of this rediscovery of church history and the church fathers is that people want to remain Protestant. They can't get on with the exclusive claims of Rome and Orthodoxy. And so Anglicanism is kind of the next best thing. And I think that's really where my pastor landed, where you
Is
still
he wearing
have,
vestments now?
oh yeah, he's got a priestly collar. Um,
Okay.
yeah, he goes by Father. So I mean, I'm happy for him. Like I actually attended his ordination to the Anglican priesthood. It was
Okay.
very Catholic. I was surprised at how much the liturgy
Yeah.
is kind of the same.
Yeah. Can be depending on where they're at in the whole ACNA world.
Yeah.
Because that's a pretty broad tent too.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, and what I've gathered is that I think the bishop here in the Anglican Diocese of Canada, that's the particular diocese for the ACNA. I think he's a bit more on the Reformed side, but I think there's churches in that diocese that maybe lean more evangelical, and there are
yeah.
some that lean more Anglo-Catholic.
Yeah.
Um,
And those dioceses, so we have a Nigerian Anglican ACNA congregation that meets in one of our rooms on Sundays. And I mean, these dioceses, like when you say the diocese, I mean, Canada, uh, Canada's huge.
yeah.
I mean,
Oh yeah.
Canada's really big. And this isn't a region where you can visit all your churches in a car in any reasonable amount of time. So, but these dioceses are sort of cut differently. So I remember meeting the bishop of the Nigerian church here, and he's Nigerian, but his wife is Korean. And I mean, it's a fascinating world. And especially now with GAFCON and this what's happened now, I mean, things are just going to be like that world is going to get even more complicated for just about everyone in that world. So,
Yeah, it reminds me of the Orthodox in some ways because they have all these different jurisdictions here
yeah,
in America and in Canada, where you've got the Greek church and the Russian church, and they started as immigrant churches, but now they're pulling in converts, and over time, the converts will be mostly like people will just be Americans, but have these I don't know. Yeah, these like national affiliations that aren't really their own.
yeah.
If you know what I'm saying. I think that the Anglicans have a little bit of that too. I didn't actually realize how many different conservative breakaway Anglican networks there are as well. I thought it was just the ACNA, but Father Calvin Robinson, he's been in like four of them at this point. It's it's crazy.
People have been for a long time. People have been trying to have a arrange a conversation between me and Calvin Robinson. It's never happened. I think I shook his hand at maybe one of the Ark things. I saw him sort of glide across the Ark. Anyway, we'll leave Calvin alone.
Yeah.
Um, Now, it would be a very Protestant thing to decide to go Catholic and never go to Mass.
Yeah.
So, talk to me about the actual Catholic Church and priest that you found, because again, well, Canada, well, I don't know how Catholic is Canada
Yeah, that's a good question. I think
besides Quebec.
Quebec would be yeah, very very Catholic. I think Canada is probably about. I think Catholics are the largest Christian denomination here. Like we don't have anything like the SBC in Canada. Um, there's a bunch of different fellowships of Baptists, but they're much smaller than anything in America. I think Catholics would be like we have a Catholic school system that is public here in Canada.
Hmm.
So which is good and bad. It's mostly bad at this point because it's almost indistinguishable from the public school, depending on which school you go to.
Yeah.
There's a lot of curriculum things that they kind of don't have any control over, and it's just very intertwined with the public system because they get public money.
Yeah.
Um, it's a mess, and I'm probably going to send my kids to a private Catholic school, to be honest. But I don't know. It'll depend on which schools are nearby when they get to be that age. Um, so it's big. But I mean, mass attendance is probably not what it was. The particular church that I go to, I think we kind of struck gold with it. It's a beautiful old building, uh, wonderful interior and icons. It's the kind of church I wanted to go to. It's like what you picture when you think about the
Did
Catholic
you have a
Church.
choice of Catholic churches you could go to?
Technically, I've learned this after the fact, but technically, you are supposed to go to the one nearest to your house. I go to the one second closest to my house. The one nearest to my house, the priest there is wonderful. We just found when we took our kids, uh, it just was not they were more disruptive than they were in this larger building that had more resources for families. So we honestly mostly chose that one due to the stage of life that we're in.
Hmm.
But the priests of both of them are younger guys. Like they're about one I think is under 40. I think our priest is about 40. And uh, just just like Orthodox guys,
Hmm. Are they
really
Canadian?
they're Canadian. Yep.
Okay.
Yep, they really take the faith seriously. They're both from around here. Like they're not
Okay.
from some other province or anything. And just a lot of reverence for the Eucharist and the Mass and what they do. There's no liturgical abuses going on in these parishes. They've got adoration all the time. They've got uh, pretty frequent confession times. I'd like some more confession times, but the sacramental life is taken very seriously. And as someone coming into the church, I wanted a really good experience of that for myself, for my wife, for my family, and I've certainly gotten that. I know it's not the case everywhere, but I think
Yeah.
in the city I live in, we're pretty lucky to have some good priests and some good parishes.
So when you say more confession, I'm just curious as, as a minister. I mean,
Sure.
how many priests are in your church and how many hours can he spend each week? I mean, because you start, I mean, the thing about ministers' jobs are they're really broad.
Hmm.
And so sometimes every now and then I've sometimes like, Pastor, I want me and you should do like something the same time each week. And it's like, you have no idea what my schedule looks like. If I'm doing something the same time each week, it's mostly on a Sunday.
Yeah.
Or it's a pretty high it ranks pretty high on my list of priorities if I sort of nail down something like that. So tell me, like in your church, how many hours is he available for confession?
Yeah. So I mean, he does 15 minutes before every weekday mass, and honestly, like most people don't take very long in the confession booth. Like when I go in, it's like a couple minutes, to be honest, and there's
Oh, you
usually
need to
about
sin more clearly. I'm sorry,
I
go
gotta.
on.
Well, if you go enough, you don't have too much to confess. But he does open it up a fair bit, like depending on the liturgical season. So I know Lent, they do increase the amount of confession times they have. We recently had an encounter night, was very Protestant. I was like, this sounds like something we would have done at my evangelical church, but it was basically an hour, a couple hours of adoration, some praise music, and a couple speakers, and there was confession available then. The church just down the street from me has about an hour on Saturday. So I mean, that's not a ton, but it's frequent enough that you can find a time if you need to go to confession. And I mean, there's there's other churches all over the city. I've driven, 20 minutes to go when that was the only time I could fit it
Yeah,
into my week.
yeah.
That is the one benefit that Catholics have versus Protestants.
Do they have a
Obviously, you guys.
website?
Yeah, there's a website called masstimes.org, and you can just go in
Huh.
there, put your location in, and then see when's mass, when's confession, when's adoration.
That's why that's a strong thing for a network. I mean, if you
Yeah,
that's kind of cool. I mean, these are just questions I have because I don't,
yeah,
obviously I don't go in that world, but that's really interesting. Um, so how many a Sunday at their how many mass services do they offer on a weekend?
yeah. So there's a Saturday evening vigil mass. It's at 4:30, but that's about an hour, and then there's three on Sunday. So there's a 9:30 and 11:30 and a 4:30 on a Sunday, and then I think the parish down the street has three on a weekend. So it's if you miss one, you can go to a different one. Like we normally go to the 11:30. That just works the best for us with bedtimes. But when we just had our second son, my wife was sleeping in quite a bit, so we hit the 4:30. It's shorter. There's no singing at that one, so it just worked a little nicer with the kids. So that you know, it is very. It's the most Protestant thing for me to be like, I'm gonna choose the one that fits my lifestyle, but like it is selfishly very nice to go and find one that works for us. Again, like that's where when I was to your question earlier about like did I choose the parish I went to, I was trying to avoid that as much as possible. I was like, I want to go to one that's close. I don't want to like church shop the way that maybe I would have in the past. Um, but people still do that a little bit.
So how many people are there? How many people do you think go through on a weekend?
I think it's around 650 to 700 at my
Okay.
particular parish. So it'd
Okay.
be like, maybe 200 for each of the morning masses and then 150 or so for the evening or afternoon ones.
Okay. 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 So good sized group of people. Um, now, do you know who Kale Zeldin is?
No, I don't.
Okay, so Kale Zeldin is in my little online circle. He's one of our more faithful Roman Catholics, and he recently did a conversation with his mother, which was a fascinating conversation because she talked about, I mean, Kale is about 10 years younger than I am. Sorry, Kale, if I have the number wrong, and you're younger even than that. But Kale's a little younger than I am, and so his mother's a little older than I am, and his mother talked about the changes that went through the Roman Catholic Church via Vatican II and all of that. How, because I grew up in northern New Jersey, fair number of Italian Catholics around us, and so you could get really good fish on Fridays at a lot of the local delis. Which me as a Protestant, I didn't know why, but I just liked the fish, so I got the fish. Um, but how much where are things at in terms of some of the really traditional aspects of, fasting on Fridays and during Lent? And how is that sort of dealt with in your church to the degree that you can? I mean, because I really feel for the priests because just my experience with Roman Catholics in America, they are all over the place in
Yeah.
so many ways.
Yes. No, I that's totally true. I think my priest. So there's a couple things. There's fasting, and there's also the holy days of obligation. Now in Canada, we get off pretty light with those. I think it's just Easter, and there's there's a Marian day of obligation as well. It's usually New Year's Day. So he does make reminder of those types of things. He does make reminders of that, but obviously whether people practice it or not
Yeah,
is another thing. I think
yeah.
maybe in some parishes the priest might be a little less pushy about some of the obligations that people have to do. Um, as for my own adoption of it, I've tried to do everything, to the letter of the law, because I think the church has power to ask that of me. Um, but admittedly, like with the two young kids right now, I think for my wife, like she hasn't always done all the fasting. And I believe she is exempt from some of the fast days. But yeah, like if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, it's not wise for you to be
Yep.
abstaining from food on
Yep.
these days. Um, so yeah, it's a bit all over the place. I talked to some older Catholics, and some of them are unaware that these are obligations. I do think there was probably a period where it just was not talked about. Maybe it was assumed that there was going to be a laxity around it. Even Fridays, I do try not to eat fish or eat meat on Fridays. I do try to stick with the fish, even though that isn't an obligation outside of the the Lent season. Um, but a lot of people that I talk to, they know that you're supposed to do some kind of abstention, but I don't think they really plan for it. So that's one that I think a lot of people kind of sleep on, and just it's they kind of know about it but don't really practice it. Even good faithful Catholics, I just don't think it's talked about enough.
Okay. Okay. How did you find me? You mentioned that you'd watched, you've seen a number of my videos. How did you find me on YouTube?
Um, I think you just popped in on my algorithm, but I got what really caught my eye was you talking about I think Metagelicalism, John Mark. You know what it was? It was I was watching that interview with Carrie Newhoff and John Mark Comer,
Oh,
trying to wrap my head around what he thinks about the church a little bit.
yeah,
Um, and I think you had reacted to it.
yeah.
And I watched your video, and I was expecting you to have maybe a strong opinion about what they were saying, but you were more so explaining what was going on, and I was like, this is very educational, and I grew to really like your approach to examining what's going on in the culture and not necessarily making a value judgment about everything. So that was quite refreshing. Um,
I'm a not a very reactionary reactor apparently. So
well,
I'm very curious, and so for me, and people, it's so funny on social media because just this morning, someone on Twitter too was I posted. I'm really digging into. I'm trying to really get my mind around what sort of the default assumptions are of kind of this broadly default American religion. And so I found this really interesting uh, statement from the war period, the Second World War period of seven pillars, and I read it and was like, wow. So I posted it on Twitter, and somebody took offense because, anything I post, I either have to be for something or against something, so that depending on if I'm for it or against it, then they know whether to be for or against me. And it's like, I don't care how you feel about the thing. I'm just fascinated by what I find and I want to talk about it and I want to talk about it with other people. So that's
yeah, there's an instinct to like have to have like instant value judgment about everything that we encounter, but I do appreciate the role that people like you play in at least just naming what's going on. And I think that's where your phrase metagelicalism is really helpful because that's certainly what I've experienced.
yeah,
And that's kind of what I was trying to address in the article is that it seems like because pastors pull from so many different sources, like they don't feel boxed in by the confessional walls that they maybe used to have.
right,
It's not a bad thing to read Henry Nouwen, for example.
right.
Everybody reads Henry Nouwen.
Yeah,
He doesn't really talk about Catholic dogma
that's
very
right.
much in his spiritual work, but
Gay
he's,
Catholic monastic
yeah,
Henry
totally.
Nouwen.
Everybody, yeah, but everybody reads them. And Dallas Willard, that was a book that my pastor actually had bought for me for my birthday one year. So,
Yeah,
so that was definitely his gateway drug into some of these other writers.
yeah,
You read Brian Zond. He
yeah,
talks about Dallas Willard all the time too.
yeah,
Obviously, John Mark Comer.
yeah.
Um, he seems like he is the gateway drug in a lot of ways. And then uh, then John Mark Comer and Brian Zahn, what they both have in common is that they pull from Catholics and they mine and Orthodox and they mine them for spiritual insight. They're focused on the contemplative practices a lot. But what's funny is where the contemplative practices butt up against maybe some things that only make sense in a Catholic worldview. So when you think of like something like penance, for example, a lot of the stuff from like Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuits, who is like one of the great Catholic mystic and contemplative writers, that only makes sense if you believe like I'm going to go to confession and I'm going to my sins, my individual sins that I'm committing now can damn me. That I need to have God's righteousness infused into me. That sanctification, my ultimate salvation depends on my sanctification. These things don't. I don't think these things really work. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in a Protestant salvation
No, the
framework.
Protestants went after these things. I mean, and some of them more than others, but this was exactly what they went after, that entire system. And no, you're exactly right. They went after that system. And you're right to point out the fact that this is a really curious thing that these Protestants are sort of going back to it and saying, you know, I can there's some value to this. But you're also right in saying that entire system sat within a worldview, and you can it's an interesting move to take those elements of that system, take them out of that worldview, and then put them in this other worldview, which is a lot less defined by the vast majority of preachers and especially the laity. Whereas, I mean, I was talking to one of my friends who's a priest, and I'll often tell people I'm not a priest. I'm a minister. And the difference in that language is significant. And there are a whole lot of there's a whole lot of church history and theological conversation beneath these differences. But regularly I'll have someone that's fine, oh, you're the minister of that church, and they'll call me father. And it's just like, well, and on and on and on. So you're exactly right that all of this stuff, and I mean, I saw that from, one of my earliest dippings into this stuff, as with many people, was Richard Foster's A Celebration of Discipline. And if you read Dallas Willard's biography, or a good Dallas Willard biography, you'll see that he and Richard Foster were sort of forerunners of, let's see, Richard Foster, was he a Quaker? And even just being a Quaker is a super interesting tradition if you know anything about the history of the Quakers.
Just a little
And
bit.
yeah, well, Mary Worthen's latest book, Spellbound, has a lot of really nice, succinct church history nuggets from the UK and the Americas. Um, but so this stuff has sort of come back into it's come back into Protestantism sort of as an experiential deepening. It's sort of come into it as, in the same way, let's say, as a new taste in music. It's sort of come into it in the same way that, let's say, Christian contemporary music came into Protestant through the Jesus movement and then the CCM church wars that happened in the 80s and 90s that I can remember. And you're too young to know these things. So, no, you're exactly right that all of this stuff, something happens when you take something that's situated in an entire world and sort of transport it over here to a different world. And what's happening with that? That's
Yeah, I mean, well, the other part was like the Eucharist. There's more churches now that are practicing it weekly, particularly in the
yep,
non-denom evangelical space,
yep,
even Pentecostals. And the Eucharist is situated obviously in a very central place
yep.
in a salvific, has salvific importance in
Yes, it does.
Catholic and Orthodox theology, where it is a sacrifice, and this is how we are participating in the sacrifice of Christ on the cross.
Right.
And that, I think the reformers maybe have a internally coherent view on what the Eucharist is. It's just interesting to me when guys like Brian Zond or guys like Nathan Finocchio and his Theos U platform are quoting Catholics about the Eucharist, even reaching back to the Church Fathers, to be honest, because I would argue a lot of maybe you might dispute this, but I think the Church Fathers had the Catholic understanding of the Eucharist. Some might say Augustine was maybe not the same, but they believe that this is Christ's body and blood, and we are participating in the propitiatory sacrifice. And I think the reformers, yeah, they believe his real presence is there in a different way, but it's not. This is not causing our salvation, maybe in the way that our initial justification ultimately will.
The I will say that the reformers, there's a big, I mean, so recently Carlos Ayer wrote a really wonderful book called, no, was it Reformations? Because in a sense, when we say the reformers and we put them all in one bucket,
Yeah.
about the one thing that they have in common in many respects is they're no longer part of the Roman Catholic group. And but Zwingli, I mean Calvin had weekly communion.
Yeah.
The Zwinglian strain, that's really where you get sort of this. This is a well, not quite. Well,
More
Jesus
of a
told us to,
memorial,
yeah,
right?
memorial. Peter Kreeft recently wrote a book comparing. I think it was Billy Graham, C.S. Lewis, and a Roman Catholic view on the Eucharist. Isn't because Peter Kreeft writes these little
Okay.
dialogues.
We'll give
So
it
yeah,
a
no,
glance.
and church fathers. I mean, I it's been really interesting watching people get excited about church fathers because the thing about church fathers are there are a lot of them, and it's not like there's sort of an authorized, well, is there or isn't there a sort of an authorized list of church fathers? Because even if you look at someone like Maximus the Confessor, I
Yeah.
mean, he gets his tongue chopped out. He's labeled a heretic, but later, so
It's messy. Yeah.
it's
It's
messy.
yeah. I mean, I guess the one way you could look at the list of church fathers is who has saint in front of their name.
Now,
Although
you could do that.
obviously, or Saint Maximus the Confessor is a saint. Origen is not, and neither is Tertullian. But nevertheless, they have writings which are foundational in present day Roman Catholic and Orthodox theology, I would say, or at least bear witness to what the church believed at the time. So it's very messy. Um, and I guess the difference with Catholics is I think the church fathers may bear witness, but we would say like the councils are the thing that are binding or the papal decrees. Whereas, you could read a church father and they might be in error, even though they were a great saint. And that would be part of doctrinal development. But like that aside, I do agree. I think the church fathers are sufficiently broad that it's a bit like the criticism that Catholics make or Protestants make the Bible a paper pope. Like that for each different Protestant, you have a different pope because they all read it differently, and you can kind of do that with the church fathers as well. And even in Orthodox and Catholic dialogues, that gets done, and they both claim to be believing uh, the infallible, incorrupt doctrine handed down. Um, where was I going with that? I mean, I think the thing about the church fathers and I want to tie this back to kind of what happened with the pandemic because with the pandemic and um, it wasn't just that church became disembodied; it was also that there was a ton of social unrest in that time as well, particularly with George Floyd. But then one thing that happened in our church, and I'm sure a lot of people saw it, is a lot of people hopped on the deconstruction bandwagon during the pandemic.
Hmm.
And particularly in regards to a lot of moral issues, I saw a lot of people that I had known, you know, kind of change their tune on abortion or
Oh,
on,
really?
yeah, yeah, totally. Um,
Huh.
and I think a lot of that, maybe it's my generational thing, but people on Instagram, getting roped into maybe more secular left wing politics, and that's starting to make them question their religious upbringings. And I think a way that a lot of pastors pushed back was in citing the church fathers, was in trying to show that Christianity has always believed this stuff, that this is not a thing that's up for debate, particularly the moral issues. Because again, as I kind of call out in the article, like the moral issues are really the ground zero for uh, divergence. Like that's where the rubber meets the road. We can disagree in a church about eschatology, or we can disagree about the exact nature of God's foreknowledge. But the things that I think ultimately cause people to leave a church or to have a falling out or to lose their faith are things that impact real life. It could be church stuff. It could be styles of worship. It could be, um, like I don't like how hard the pastor comes down on sin, or it could be my pastor says I can't remarry again after being divorced. It could be my pastor um, now is marrying LGBT people. People leave churches over those kinds of things, um, and that's I mean I think rightly so. I think a lot of moral issues get relegated to secondary theological issues. Like we can have unity on the essentials, but disagreement on the non-essentials and charity and those things. But I've found it personally very difficult to have to counsel someone, for example, if we have fundamental disagreements on moral teachings. How can I give you advice if we don't agree on what you should do or what is permitted for you to do in this difficult moral circumstance?
Talk to me about your article. First of all, when did you start? When did you start the Substack?
I started the Substack earlier this year. I noticed there was a lot of great writing on there, and my pastor had joined the Substack, so I wanted to subscribe to him and support him. Um, I started working on the article, I think, in March, and I think I didn't finish it until July. Uh, I was just kind of working on it in evenings as kind of an outlet for all these things that I was thinking about. I don't think I necessarily make the strongest um, arguments in every part of the article, but I was like, I'm this might be the only thing I ever write. I just want to get this all out there,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
hopefully it strikes a nerve because I think other people are feeling this too, and this is what I'm seeing. I wrote a couple other pieces just as the inspiration hit, but this was really the main thing I wanted to talk about on Substack. And luckily, enough people read it that I feel like the job was done. Um,
Yeah, I mean, well, it got to me through Paul Anleitner, so you clearly, he doesn't know you personally, I assume. So,
no,
it's a pretty cool thing to write a Substack that goes viral at least sufficiently
yeah,
to go some places.
yeah, exactly. Well, it's cool to get to talk to Paul Vanderklay. So
So if you lived in Sacramento, it's nowhere near as cool. It's only cool on the
yeah,
internet.
yeah.
Um,
Well, exactly. We all live on the internet now.
yeah.
Uh,
Well,
yeah.
well,
So
so let's talk about it.
yeah, for sure. I'm curious, like, how it rubbed you because obviously you're in the Christian Reformed Church. I started the article off in a bit of a provocative way where you can do three things in response to learning what the church fathers taught. Ignore them and keep attending your church. You can convert to Catholicism or Orthodoxy or maybe Anglicanism, or you can rearrange the facts of church history to make them make sense post hoc, and that's what I address in the article. I assume you would fall more into category one, even though it's a maybe unflattering portrait of uh, of your beliefs.
so, so I was in Italy a couple summers ago, and I just tweeted that I was heading to Rome, and someone on Twitter said something like, and a whole group of people suddenly suddenly get swell with optimism that I'm heading to Rome.
Yeah.
Um, Well, no, and I think, your piece, those 3 points at the beginning of it, if you're an evangelical, you can do one of three things in response to learning what the church fathers taught. My what I see with the church fathers is that there are a lot of them, and they taught a lot of different things. And part of what this Orthodox moment is bringing is that, yeah, because the Orthodox come to America and they have like this massive storeroom, and you have a bunch of Americans running around who know very little about history, much less church history, and the Orthodox bring something out and says, "Look at this." And they're like, well, what's
It's
that?
pretty cool what they have.
Yeah, they got a lot of stuff back there. And that's part of it, is that they've got a lot of stuff. And church fathers can be a pretty you put them all in a group and they can be a pretty squirrely bunch. And but like what you said about what say let's say Dallas Willard or John Mark Comer are doing to sort of mining the church tradition for things, bringing them out into their Protestant church. Um, the same thing happens with church fathers, that all of these church fathers have historical contexts within which they write. And part of the difficulty of the church fathers, which is, the same difficulty we often face with respect to exegeting the epistles in the New Testament, is we might not know a lot about what they're, the context out of which they're writing. And so scholarship sort of continues, and we've seen that with Origen and in fact for a good many church fathers, the people with whom they're engaging, almost all we know about the people with whom they're engaging, we're getting from them, which of course is an interesting thing, because if all anybody knew about the people with whom I'm engaging is what is actually in my videos, it's a pretty narrow library compared to everything that's out there right now. So, to me, what caught my interest is in many ways sort of this metagelical moment, because part of what has fueled, I'd say, hmm, my friend Sam Tiedemann recently did a couple videos on moralistic therapeutic deism. Um, what has sort of fueled the basic religious assumptions of the vast majority of Americans or Canadians, whether or not they actually go to church. Because one of the things that I know is that for a majority of people who go to church, they share a majority of the assumptions of people who don't go to church out there. And even if they're listening to sermons, there needs to be a fairly high level of interest and or catechesis that people have if they're actually going to develop views that differ from their neighbors on a whole range of things, especially religious things, especially things that get into questions of, let's say, perdition and damnation. Because I think, in part of what happened in, I can speak about the United States, Canada's a little bit different, but part of what happened in the United States was when people were suddenly forced into highly pluralistic environments, and now suddenly they're going to school with just a tremendous diversity of people from other countries, people who have backgrounds, however foggy, in Islam and other aspects of Christianity. And again, if you read I'm currently reading Molly Worthen's book, Spellbound. American religious history is weird. There are so many weird things out there. And today we might bump into the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Latter-day Saints or some of these things. But the and then you bring in, okay, so I've got a Sikh friend, I've got all of these Roman Catholic friends, half of whom identify as Catholic, and when you talk to them, they'll say things like, oh, I've got all this unresolved guilt in my life because of my Catholic upbringing, and what I really want to do is just get rid of it so I can do what I want guilt-free. But my parents raised me, and especially people my age, my parents raised me in this deep Catholic tradition. And so all I really wind up doing is worrying about my sinning and how much I'm not going to confession or not going to mass. And so what I basically do when I'm out there is default into something you might hear from Donald Trump, where he says, I really don't think I'm going to get into heaven because I've probably really not lived a very good life. I've cheated on every wife I've had numerous times. I lie regularly, and basically almost everything I do, I there's a decent slice of self-interest in it. So, so that's why he can be on Air Force One and say, yeah, I really don't know if I'm actually going to make it to heaven, because his idea is, but then again, I mean, people have been studying these religious assumptions just out there in the population for a very long time in North America. And So then it's interesting to me when I'm now in a new age of religious observance. So, on one hand, when we do an estuary conference, we've got some Roman Catholics, we've got some Orthodox, and one of the things I recommend to people who are doing a conference is like if you're going to have a church service sort of attached to it, because a lot of these things we do in Christian Reformed churches, I'll say make sure we don't have Lord's Supper because that will
Right.
then quickly become the most divisive, ironically, the most divisive element of the liturgy. Because right away, if the Catholics and the Orthodox haven't sort of snuck out to a Catholic or an Orthodox church near them, near the conference, they're certainly not going to partake. And so basically, what you're going to have is all of the Protestants and some of the people who aren't quite sure how to categorize themselves, maybe they'll go up and partake, depending on how open or closed communion is. And so, but yet, and this is where your article caught my attention, how many people today, be they, and you know this because you've lived in various camps, hardcore evangelicals or Roman Catholics or Orthodox, how many of them are going to say, I worry about Paul Vanderklay's soul because he's not Orthodox or Catholic or he Paul hasn't been baptized since he was 1 month old. You know, he made a profession of faith. What does that mean? In other words, we are awash not just in pluralism in general, we're awash in Christian pluralism. And most people kind of go around and say, I think Paul's a Christian. You know, I think so. Even if he and I'm not particularly offended if someone tells me, well, Vanderklay, your Protestant Dutch Calvinism just isn't going to cut it when you've got all of these. You've never been to confession.
Mm.
You've never had a valid. You've never partaken in a valid Eucharist because if I go to a Roman Catholic church, I'm not going to just slide in there and get it. No,
Yeah.
I know the rules. I'm not
Yeah.
going to, I want to respect them. So, and so we're living in a very interesting time when most Catholics and Orthodox, I don't corner them. I'm not going to corner you, but they kind of act like Paul's a Christian. He's kind of one of us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I mean, that's a complicated thing for me as a Catholic with so many Protestant family members for sure. Like that's a difficult part of this because I have to affirm that yeah, like you do need to ordinarily take the Eucharist and you do need to be baptized and you do need to confess your mortal sins.
Most
At,
Catholics and some Orthodox would recognize my baptism because it was a
yeah, and
Trinitarian
for sure,
baptism.
for sure. That's the complicating factor, I guess, for Catholics in particular. I know the Orthodox will some of them will rebaptize you, whereas my grandpa baptized me in a lake, and I didn't have to get rebaptized when I came into the Catholic Church. And I believe the date that I was baptized originally is on my confirmation certificate that I got from the Catholic Church. So there's a sense in which like we do have Christian brotherhood, you and me, given our shared Trinitarian baptism. And the Catechism says that much. And I believe the Catechism also says, I think I said this in my article, that those who through no fault of their own, I don't know what that means exactly, but who through no fault of their own were born into a tradition that isn't the Catholic Church, it can still be saved. So it's not like an automatic damnation. You may still be damned on some other basis, but it wouldn't just be because you were born into the Anglican Church in the year 1600 when nobody knew if they were Catholic still or what was going on. Um, that's a fascinating episode from history. But you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
it is a little bit gray in some sense. But the pluralism, I agree. I think I was thinking about Cliff Neckley the other like recently. I
I don't
saw a
know who that
meme on
is.
Okay, so him and his son, Stuart Neckley, they go around on the university campuses and basically do Christian apologetics. Kind of not like kinder street preaching, almost a little bit like what Charlie Kirk used to do.
Uh, They're
But
Protestants?
they're Protestants, yeah,
Okay.
they're evangelicals. And he's had a couple like Orthodox guys come up to him while he's doing his apologetics, and basically challenge him on like, how do you know you have the right Bible? Why don't you take the Eucharist? These kinds of things. And I wrote actually a post on Substack recently about how like there isn't really a nice Romans road, maybe the way for Catholics and Orthodox, the way there is for Protestants. Believe in the Lord Jesus and you'll be saved, where you can really condense the salvation message down to something nice
And
like that
effective.
and
I mean,
effective.
that's when you go
Totally.
forward into Billy Graham
Yeah.
and you pray the sinner's prayer, bang.
Yes.
And it's
Well,
even before, they hook you up with some local church to baptize you.
right.
So, I mean, that's part of, again, this question of packages that we're talking about.
Well, that is actually a fascinating episode from American history. I read about this in Ross Douthat's book, Bad Religion. I
Yeah,
consider that like everyone should read that
it's a
book.
great book.
Where I think wasn't it true that in during the Billy Graham Crusades, like there were Catholics at those, and some people were sent out to a Catholic church. I don't know that it was
I
just
wouldn't be surprised.
right. So I think there is some pluralism already kind of baked into the evangelical message where this is what you have to do to be saved. Yeah, go find a church that teaches the Bible. Also, we're not going to tell you which churches are in and which are out. Like you kind of got to go do that on your own. And so I think a lot of people come to faith without as a bit of a blank canvas, without any idea of like what are the guardrails of the faith that I should belong to. And that was kind of the case for me. I had some upbringing, but it was varied enough that I was still somewhat of a blank canvas as a young adult in terms of how I should pursue the faith going forward. But yeah, back to the pluralism. I think because the evangelical message is so simple, a lot of people and not conditioned on anything that I do, it is very easy to maintain that pluralism in a predominantly evangelical country like the United States of America. And there is a sense in which that has conditioned the Catholicism of America to be a very similar way. Um, I know actually a church. This is a tangent, but there's a church in somewhere in the middle of the country in a flyover state where it's a Catholic church, but it looks like an evangelical megachurch, and they actually have a non-ordained guy giving the sermon like every single week, and so it's just a very
Well, you
unique.
could do that though.
You can,
He
oh
just
yeah,
can't do the Eucharist.
yeah, exactly. Yes, he can't confect the Eucharist,
Right.
but yeah, like the America absolutely shapes Catholicism, and the broader water that Catholics are swimming in America isn't evangelical water. I mean, you look at how many Catholics spoke out about Charlie Kirk and called him a martyr,
Bishop
basically.
Barron was
Yeah,
at the memorial service,
right.
the big one.
Exactly.
Did he speak or was he just in attendance?
I don't think he spoke. I
I
think he
I
just
didn't actually sit down and watch the whole 5 hours. That was a little much, but sorry, I just
I
offended a whole group of people.
I didn't watch it either. I mean, yeah,
How dare you?
I have complicated feelings about that, but like it's yeah, it was almost a little bit it was like the 21st century version of, in some ways, of a Billy Graham crusade. Like there was that spirit of like the gospel being preached, all these different Christian groups there kind of uniting behind this one cause. My grandparents actually, going back to them as Pentecostal missionaries, like they would attend these, in the wake of Vatican II, these ecumenical gatherings with charismatic Catholics.
Yeah.
And I mean, they would be invited to speak to them and like impart their knowledge of the Holy Spirit's activity as Pentecostals to these Catholics.
Yeah.
Um, I think they were the ones that, I mean, they got to know their Catholic priest friend, through that conference, and he was like so eager to learn from them, and it is fascinating. I know Brian Zond, even like he's not Pentecostal, but he gets invited to speak to Catholics and Orthodox um, religious, and th yeah, that could only happen in an America where there is this implicit understanding that we have a shared brotherhood and sisterhood in Christ. That
Yeah.
like maybe you're going to heaven even without all the Catholic sacraments.
Now in
Uh,
Canada, what's the because Canada's more my impression is Canada's more like Europe in terms
Yeah.
of the level of secularity is higher.
hmm
Um, what's your take in Canada with respect to these issues? I mean, it seems like most people in Canada now you've got even more immigration, so you're going to have other religions sort of getting more organized.
Yeah, I think your read is definitely correct. I'd say Canada's like midway between the U.S. and Europe. I lived in Europe for for a semester abroad, and you could feel the secularity, even though there's more churches there than there are here.
What country did you live in, or did you
It
just
was the
travel all over?
UK, but I
Oh,
traveled. I did travel all over
okay, yeah.
during my reading break. Um, and yeah, it's um, as far as the perception of religion. I mean, I definitely think people are more hostile to it here. Like there's Quebec kind of led the way on this, actually. Ironically, given that they're more Catholic, but they inherited the French value of secularism, of the strict separation of church.
Religionlessness.
Religionlessness is really, yeah, more what it is. Like they have, they ban their public servants from wearing hijabs, for example, and things like that in Quebec. So this is actually probably one of the motivating factors in my conversion as well, is because it's already so hard to talk about religion in Canada.
Hmm.
So when you're a Protestant, it's like, okay, well, what do you actually believe? No one actually really knows what that is. Like, there's so few like people like I was, Protestant evangelicals here. A lot of people understand Catholicism, and so it's I
When
had a
you say a
difficult.
lot of people understand Catholicism, what do you mean?
I mean, like a lot of people went to Catholic schools and
Okay,
took religion class, right? In the town that I lived in, for example, like half the town was like legacy Catholic.
okay.
So there was a public school and a Catholic school, and I think more kids actually went to the Catholic school in that town. So there's a very wide, it's in the water. People know what the church teaches. They have to take religion class. People hear about what the church teaches. Um, Whereas, with Protestantism, it's a little bit more of a mystery. Like, what is it? Who are those guys? Are they those freaky people like in the States, those weird Christian nationalists? There's a bit of that association, of course, with Protestants, at least in the year 2025. Um, but I, it's like if you're going to evangelize, for me, it never sat right with me that I couldn't tell people, okay, if you're going to become a Christian, here's what you should do. I Beyond the Romans road, I felt like I didn't really have a roadmap for people, and I didn't feel like I could trust that if successfully evangelized someone, that they would have all the next steps they needed, because Protestant churches don't really bind you to any kind of rule of life, and this is kind of what I was trying to get at with the article, is that John Mark Comer is coming up with a rule of life that he wants people to get into. And Dallas Willard, the spirit of the disciplines, he suggests this rule of life. He suggests these disciplines, but there's not church attendance isn't mandatory on Sundays. You can really skate by with easy beliefism if you want to. And I don't know that there's like a hard line drawn that if you don't go to church, you're not really saved. The definition of are you really saved or are you really in friendship with God just seems very kind of nebulous and undefined. And I found that hard because I couldn't really give good advice as an evangelist. I couldn't even counsel people uh, properly in my small group. Like I don't know. That was some of the tension I found, and with Catholicism, it's very black and white. It's very laid out. I know the moral teachings. I know the obligations we have as Catholics. Um, I really needed that. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you just articulated a big reason why there is a lot of movement towards orthodoxy and Catholicism and not sort of this I think this Protestant formula, I think for a lot of people looks too easy to be believed.
Yeah,
And for that reason, the rigor of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, even though Protestants have their own rigor in other ways,
for sure. Yeah,
but the rigor of of Catholicism and Orthodoxy is is attractive and gives people some grit. And I see this too in some Protestant settings where, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Protestants expressed grit too. I mean, and this was very true in the Christian Reformed Church because if you might miss a Sunday, maybe it was sick, you missed two Sundays, and you might get if there's telephones, you might get a phone call from the elders, and we've noticed that you haven't, taken advantage of the means of grace being the preaching of the word. Oh, Pastor, I'm continuing to be sick. Okay, no problem. Or elder. But and in many Protestant churches, there is a lot of checking up, a lot of
mm,
policing, a lot of enforcement. And
yeah,
I think a lot of that went out in the 70s
mm,
for a lot of these, I think a lot of implicit universalism
mm,
or implicit moralistic therapeutic deism, where there's sort of a community standard out there of what's good and what's bad.
yeah,
And maybe you get a certain number of stumbles and demerits, but if you're married three times and cheat on all three wives, odds are good. I don't know if you're going to make the cut. So
yeah,
maybe you should just have as good a time as possible, before you actually worry about and meeting Judgment Day. But it's also the case that D. James Kennedy was a Presbyterian minister, Coral Ridge, Florida, and he developed a Protestant evangelist tool called Evangelism Explosion. And this was you would go door to door and you would ask the question, if you were to die tonight, what would you say to have Christ let you into his heaven? And this was a very popular evangelistic tool 20, 30 years ago. I think if you knocked on doors and posed that question to people today, number one, people just they don't believe. Basically, my take on perdition is sort of similar to where Donald Trump is, in that good people go to heaven, bad people maybe go someplace else or disappear, in annihilationism. Um, and the difference between good and bad tends to be, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Idi Amin, Jim Jones, people who did really bad things. Yeah, they're going to be really in trouble. And my neighbor with that barking dog, I've told that, shut that dog up. Him too.
yeah,
But you got to do something like you have to be a killer or a murderer. And then they've got this whole group of gray areas like my aunt had an abortion. Is where does that and so you have, and this is just sort of how people do this. And I think, like you said, having a very well laid out list of requirements says to people, well, it's clear. I need to get to mass. I need to get to confession. There's observances, and the project is very clear. And I
mhm,
think that's very attractive to people. Whereas, well, I got saved in this one church, And then I felt a little bad. So I got saved in this other church over there too. Both of them baptized me. And then I went to this other church and I really liked the pastor. He said I didn't really need to be baptized, but I'm not so sure he's right. And I keep kind of asking him, okay, so you say I don't need to be rebaptized again, but I did a lot of bad things between church 2 and 3. And so could you maybe baptize me again just to be sure?
Yeah.
And then I went on this little trip to Israel and they were like I could get baptized in the Jordan River and I think, well, I got baptized with that sacrament of water and he only like put some on my head. It would really be more powerful if I went and got baptized in the Jordan River because that's, where John the Baptist did it and Jesus' disciples did it. So Jordan's going to have some real water. And I think a church that just has a much more fleshed out system appeals to people.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. I think Shia LaBeouf, he, famously converted to Catholicism, and he said, as an actor, I have a call sheet and it tells me where I need to be and when, and that's what the Catholic Church gives me. And so that is a big part of it. I think to your point about the pastors, though, you're talking about a scenario where someone goes from church to church and they're told different things by different pastors. I think the other thing that the Catholic Church has going for it in terms of its claims, whether you believe this or not, is the claim to apostolic succession. Same with the Orthodox, that we are handing on the faith that was passed down by the laying on of hands to these bishops and priests, and so that we actually have this ministry that only we can do. And so there's a sense in which the claims to bind and loose, the claims to when the Paul talks about submitting to your elders, for they keep watch over your souls. Some of those verses, it's like, oh, okay, so these are the elders that I need to put over my souls, not just Pastor Jim that I choose because I like his church.
Right.
And for me, that was definitely another big part of it. Was I not only is the expectations clear, but the fact that these are the expectations I'm supposed to follow seems clear to me as well.
Yeah.
And that's where I guess the rest of Christianity just kind of felt like a bit of a choose your own adventure,
Yeah. Yeah.
it, for me.
Yeah. I can really see that. And I see that happening. I see that happening now. And even in the Protestant world, it's part of the reason why people are, I often contrast liberation and rigor. And really since the 60s, stock has been rising for liberation. And
Yes.
liberation has sort of peaked now, and rigor is on the rise.
Yeah.
And I think if you look back over church history, you see, the tension between these two sides going up and down between liberation and rigor. And no, I very much see, I think you articulated it well. I very much see what you're saying. And I think that a lot of people are understanding that and sort of moving in a direction like that. They want a church that takes itself seriously. And if the church doesn't even take itself seriously, then why should I take you seriously?
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge thing, especially for generations whose parents had, as in your case, parents had a lot of religious mobility.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That's a really great point. And actually, I kind of wanted to. I've been fascinated by the Christian Reformed Church for a long time because there's a lot of them around here where I live in Ontario, and my wife grew up near a lot of people in the CRC, Norfolk County in particular. There's tons of Dutch farmers there, and uh, what I observe a slightly similar pattern. I feel like with the CRC as I do with Catholics, in
yes.
that it's a people from a particular immigrant country that stay in the same church and they kind of hand that on. And so like if you have an Irish last name, you're assumed to have some Catholic ancestry. or Italian. If you have a Ukrainian last name, well, I guess you could be Catholic, but you're probably Orthodox or one of the two.
Or
Russian seems,
evangelical. A lot of
or evangel.
Ukrainian evangelicals running around.
That's true. There's a lot of Ukrainians in out west here in Canada. But and then if you're Dutch, you probably go to a Dutch Reformed church. I do know some Dutch Catholics, but depending on where you live in Ontario, you could probably guess which they are.
Yep.
Norfolk County, very Dutch Reformed, and they are kind of when I think about like the places where Protestantism took hold during the Reformation, like England, Scotland, uh, Germany, they all kind of came over, and I feel like there was a bit of a melting pot, and English people married German people and married Scottish people, and so I've got a weird, I'm a mix of all three, and I do have some Irish as well, but whereas the Dutch kind of stayed they stayed among themselves. Like the Dutch married other Dutch people and they stayed Dutch Reformed. And those churches are, like among the most, I don't know, they're probably the most thriving Calvinist churches as far as I can tell. I look at a lot of Presbyterian churches and they seem to have gone the way of most main lines. I don't know what your demographics are like, but my read on them is they're still very strong communities and there's still a lot of vitality in Dutch Reformed churches. Um, where I'm going with that is that I think as a Protestant, I would have said you should stay in the church that your parents went to. Like you should stay in the church where you have ties because God gave you those ties. Those are your people. And so I definitely looked down on people that would go church shopping a lot. Like I think you should stay where you're planted. Now, obviously, that depended on a looser, a more generous orthodoxy. Like I think as long as you hold to this vague, undefined list of essential doctrines, like stay at that church. Don't go looking for another one because the music's better. Tend to the people that you love. Um, so, but obviously now as a Catholic, someone with a more Protestant background going into a Catholic church, there's an element of a culture shock that I now feel going in where I look around my parish and it's mostly Filipinos and Italians and people from traditionally Catholic countries. A few Irish. So it's like, okay, you're my people as well, I guess. But um, yeah, that's I don't know. There's that aspect at play where it's not just about the beliefs. There's the family ties, and
Yes.
I guess in a culture to bring it back now to this pluralism, in a culture where people are less religious than they used to be, and there maybe is like a generational gap between religious belief and generational gap between like the last generation who actually attended church and my generation, and maybe I'm converting now back to the faith. There's these immigrant communities are kind of dissolving or cross-pollinating in a way that's really interesting. And I guess this kind of brings us back to where we started of like there's all these Orthodox churches with different jurisdictions, all these Anglican churches with different jurisdictions. The future of Christianity in America is going to be it's going to be really fascinating. Yeah, I would love your thoughts on that, especially since I talked so much about the Christian Reformed Church.
No, well, you're picking up on something. Um, the Canadian immigration was later than the immigration that brought my ancestors. My ancestors came to America at the end of the 19th, very beginning of the 20th century, the Frisians in Massachusetts, and then crazy Jewish family that snuck in among the Dutch in Western Michigan. But in Canada, the these were war refugees that came to
Okay.
Canada, and I mean, you could talk to one of my friends, Nate Van Dennen. They came to Canada with they were going to build, and they built, and they kept strong walls around their community, and they policed and they enforced. And for other Dutch refugees, they were an attractive community in that, well, they spoke the language. They were all Dutch and they were thriving. They came to Canada and they were going to thrive. Plus, you had the fact that they're coming from this tiny little nation in Europe that had just been, terribly, worked over by the Germans. And the dream of most of these rural Dutchmen was to have a dairy. And now you can actually go to North America and have a dairy. And these people just came to North America and with their Dutch or their Dutchness and their the suffering at their back, they built something and they kept their walls up. Now, the dynamics in the United States, because the emigration was 50 years, 50 to 70 years older, you had two other generations in there in the States, and so they became more and more part of America. But plus, you had one of the things that the Christian Reformed Church did was we built a stack of institutions that were our own. So you only went to Christian Reformed churches, and you would wherever you moved in the country, if you had like 30 or 50 people that were from the CRC and they moved to another city, the CRC would help you start your CRC there. And then very quickly, the expectation was you're going to start a Christian school right there
Mm.
for your own kids. And all of the Dutch institutions, the CRC institutions were stacked up to afford this ecosystem. And, it really wasn't until the 80s and the 90s that the CRC began to disassemble this. But the Canadian experience is different from the American experience. And I think the Canadian experience has been more intense on both angles. I think on one hand, you had some Canadian communities that really stuck together, and yet other Canadian communities that really decided to participate in the freer, more open society. And right now, the Christian Reformed Church is just having a split, and there's coming up a meeting of some of the CRCs in the United States are probably going to try to assimilate into the Reformed Church in America, but there are hardly any of those in Canada. So those Canadian groups that want to be able to have openness to evolve and allow same-sex marriage, there's double digits of those, but not triple digits, 30, 20, 30 churches. They might start their own new denomination, real little tiny one in Canada, because of the Christian Reformed Church as a whole decided no on same-sex marriage, and they're going to enforce it. So, and again, you're right in that people pick up this rigor that is sort of the Christian Reformed Church was sort of liberation, liberation, but there's a new rigorist element in the Christian Reformed Church rising, and people are finding that attractive. And so we're in some of the conservative churches, they're picking up new people. But that if you don't have a Dutch last name, it might be a little, you know,
Yeah,
people
there's some
try to
growing pains.
yeah, people try to play Dutch bingo with you, and it's like, I'm not related to anyone Dutch. Oh, well, how am I supposed to locate you in my universal history? Um,
That's
so,
funny.
so
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
happening.
It's very much like the Orthodox experience. It sounds like, if you there's a lot of Orthodox churches in the Tri-Cities where I live. Like there's a Macedonian Orthodox church, which I learned they're in schism with a couple of the bigger. Anyway, you go to one of those and it's an ethnic church. The Dutch, that might be a little more intelligible to someone who's not Dutch because but at this point you're all speaking English. And,
Exactly.
and so you're culturally very similar to everybody else. So you might play Dutch Blitz. Is that still
Dutch
or
Dutch
is that not
Blitz?
a is that have you heard of that?
No.
Okay, never mind. Maybe it's not actually a Dutch game, but my wife plays it, and I assume she picked it up in her days of living amongst Dutch Reformed people.
Oh,
But
it could be a Canadian thing.
yeah,
I'll get notes when this goes out, and But
Yeah.
again, the American and the Canadian, it's an interesting relationship between those two because the longer both groups are in the two countries, the dynamics of those countries then impact and shape. So your CRCs south of the border will be much more evangelical.
Right.
And north of the border, I think are well, they're different.
Yeah.
And as the history goes, part of the reason why the majority of Canadian CRCs likely will not split away with this group that's talking about splitting away is number one, they're comfortable with the Christian Reformed position on traditional marriage, and number two, Canada, I mean, so many Canadians live in that ribbon that's just north of the border.
Right along the border. Yeah.
And so churches that are in Ontario, they tend to have more in common with churches in West Michigan, and
Right.
churches that are in British Columbia have more in common with churches that are in Washington and Oregon. And
Right.
so it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, the breadth of Canada is quite interesting, but yeah, those of us who live right along the border are definitely more influenced. I think we're more influenced by American culture than maybe we realize. At the same time, yeah, it's whatever state is directly to our south, and there's tons of reasons for that. But yeah, I've been obviously climate impacts a lot of our lifestyles and our hobbies and what we do, but um, yeah, I guess with the Dutch Reformed Church, I'm interested in that rigor in the institutions that it seems like the CRC has built. This seems like Redeemed Zoomer's dream that you guys came and built these institutions and you managed to stay in the. It seems, if I'm reading you correctly, you stayed more conservative as far as the main body
Well,
goes.
we just had that major fight.
Okay.
And so, in many ways, the liberationists had been those who were pretty much in control of the denomination. And over time, more and more we'd had a split over women in church office, and then when the same-sex marriage thing came, I think those at the top thought that, well, that will go like saying like the women in church office fight went, and I said no, it won't. Plus, part of what happened, and I think this is overall within evangelical churches, there were more deconstructions among churches that tended to be just more open to the continual progressive themes in American culture. And I
Hmm.
think they lost a lot more of a generation, whereas the conservative churches did a better job of holding their youth. So 30 years later, you had deacons and elders, mostly from conservative churches, who are now pastors, deacons, and elders in the denomination, and they're the ones making the decision. Then you had the denomination for years had been trying, like many denominations, broaden out ethnically, and they would always sort of put their confessional ideas out there. And so the CRC picked up a lot of non-Dutch people who
Hmm.
liked the conservative confessional stance. And so when we had this fight in 2022 to 2025, the CRC progressives were suddenly completely blindsided because they were completely unaware of how the church had been changing and getting more conservative over the last 30 years. I got a lot of videos about this.
Yeah.
And 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 part of it was that a lot of the more CRC progressives accumulated in the Grand Rapids area where all our institutions were, but
Hmm.
they just completely lost touch with what was going on throughout the rest of the US and Canada in the church. So then when they had this vote about, which was basically about same-sex marriage, and vote after vote, it was 70-30, 70-30, 70-30, and they were losing every vote, then suddenly they had no idea how the world had changed. But
Right.
there it
There
had.
is that the vibe shift is very like generational. I mean, you see these recent surveys of Catholic priests where the younger ones are overwhelmingly Orthodox and conservative, but the ones that maybe were ordained around the time of Vatican II are overwhelmingly liberal.
Yep.
And it does seem like there's this lag effect with even the politics of the Vatican. Like Pope Francis's papacy and even some of the bishops like Cardinal Cupich in Chicago that are in power now, the things that they're doing are kind of this last gasp of that era before this vibe shift takes over. And like I said, the priests that are in my town and the two guys closest to me who are younger are very orthodox. They're conservative. They wear the cassock. They they want nice things in the church. They don't want the felt banners and the beige carpets. They want to do away with that stuff. And that is definitely, again, coming out of the pandemic when we had so much social upheaval, I think churches, even I saw this in my church, like our Overton window, I think for like the range of social views we could tolerate seemed pretty broad. And I think we were forced to tighten it a bit
Yeah.
because you see basically anybody that was on the left side of the Overton window departed. And a lot of them left the faith altogether in the aftermath of that. So yeah, that's another fascinating thing, and I do wonder if there will be a reaction to that in 30 to 40 years, because as much as like we want to hope now, maybe if you're more of a conservative persuasion, you want to hope that yeah, all these Catholic priests who are conservative, that's the permanent future of the church in America and Canada, but that might be a bit naive.
I think the so we tend, this is just an axiom of mine, because consciousness and because attention is rather monofocal, duality, we are prone to seeing dualities. And so we can talk progressive and conservative. But, again, I've been reading lately because I've been interested in the 19th century European history and how that has led to where we are. So I've been reading a bunch of stuff on Pius the Ninth, for
Hmm.
example, and and then Leo the 13th. And it's fascinating the way, because on one hand you might say, well, Pius the Ninth is really conservative,
Hmm.
and he is. But the issues he's conservative on are very much a part of that time. And so it isn't until, well into Leo the 13th's reign that the Pope actually permits Italian Catholics to vote for ministers of parliament.
Hmm.
Because what had been happening, there was an uprising. So 1848, you have all of these revolts throughout Europe. End of 1848, 1849, there's a revolt all throughout the Papal States, and um, and Pius the Ninth flees to the Kingdom of Naples, and then finally Austria, the Austrian Empire, and retakes most of the Papal States. France comes in, retakes Rome, and then the Pope goes back to Rome. It's a long, fascinating history. I do nothing of it. It's just a fascinating history. And then, but in 1870, the House of Savoy is basically conquering all of Italy except Rome. And in 1870, he takes Rome. And the papacy, Pius the Ninth, basically declares he's prisoner of the Vatican. He's not going to leave until they restore his temporal realm. And you see this fight from 1870 to the 1920s over this question of a temporal realm. And part of this was prohibiting Italian Catholics from participating in parliamentary elections. Now, when finally Leo the 13th allows Catholics to participate in Italian elections, well, suddenly the Catholic Church is a real player in Italian politics.
Yeah.
And and of course, Leo the 13th is remembered for, you know, this one, papal teaching which is very much pro worker.
Yeah,
And
Rerum
so
Novarum.
that's right. And
I
so
just read
then,
that this year. Yeah.
yeah, so then you have this other big swing. But in the end of the 19th century, the question of workers, I mean, they're all really looking at socialism and they're really nervous, especially once you have the Russian Revolution and you have this entire world of the Orthodox Church sort of, swallowed by communism. I mean, it's a wild time. And so these are categories of conservative and progressive. The elements of those categories just keep changing
Yeah,
depending on the context that they're in.
that
And
that is so
so
true.
and so you're exactly right when you look at, let's say, the papacy of Francis and now the new one of a new Leo.
Hmm.
I was saying Benedict 13th, I think Leo the 13th. This new Leo who sort of wants to echo that, but that workers' rights in our current political climate is a little different, even than what it was from the 1970s. I mean, I just watched this Ezra Klein interview where he basically says, the Democratic brand among labor in America is garbage
Yeah,
because they have lost the white working class vote.
right.
And if you remember, the Democrats had a lock on that really until Reagan. So then you have the question of like these social issues and how they play in it. And I mean, so history, as things change, it's super hard to know because I'm old enough to remember when John Paul II comes in, and, a lot of my friends are like, finally the Catholic Church is going to have the priests we love or the
Yeah,
Pope we
right.
love. And then Benedict came right after him. And so it's
Yeah,
like, yeah, but then what happened with Francis? And you've got someone like Rod Dreher who, grows up sort of nominal Methodist, joins the Catholic Church, and but then leaves the Catholic Church for the Orthodox because he's sick of dealing with priests that don't want to basically teach and police
hmm,
Catholic teaching.
yeah,
But you're exactly right that now you have this whole group of young priests coming in who they want rigor and they're finding an audience and people are coming to, and of course, but of course, if you're my age, so many, and I see this in the Christian Reformed Church, so many of the people who are my age and older are watching this and they're just confused. They cannot get their mind around it because they were so formed
hmm,
in this 1960s, 70s counterculture that says the next generation is going to be more progressive than the last. And the conservatives believe that too.
I
And
used to believe
now,
that
yeah, and
myself.
now we're watching it. It's like, um, and then I say to the boomers, because I'm just at the end of the boomers, I'm saying, y'all rebelled against your parents and your grandparents, and your kids and your grandkids are doing to you what you did to them.
Yeah,
And, but only some of them, because just as it was in the 60s, not everyone in the 60s and 70s, wore flowers and smoked pot and tried LSD. By no
yeah,
means. There were many dutiful people. So now you've got dutiful young progressives who are, in a weird way, more conservative than the ostensibly conservative rigorists like yourself who are doing the radical thing and saying, I'm becoming Roman Catholic.
yeah.
And the older generations are like,
You what?
exactly.
Yeah.
And
No,
so I'm old enough to have seen this thing happen twice, but in different directions. So even if, I mean, I assume things will continue to change and we have no idea what AI is going to bring. We have no idea about all these jitters of war. We have no idea about whole ranges of things. So I'm probably not going to live long enough to see, I'm in my early 60s now. How long will I live? I have no idea what medical technology will be available and or affordable when I'm my mother's age. I have no idea.
yeah.
So I I'm just like, I don't know. But
Yeah.
I'm just listening and trying to understand. I mean, when what you caught in my videos is the way I am because, you know, it's between you and God and your priest, the shape of your faith, and I'm going to respect that.
Yeah.
It's not my job to start tinkering with you because good grief. You're a father and you got a wife and you got kids. You don't need some Calvinist minister tinkering with you from across a border.
Totally. Well,
So,
I mean, yeah, and definitely as a new convert, I have to guard myself to against the urge to proselytize because I'm really excited about all the new stuff I get to do as a Catholic. But, um, yeah, no, I appreciate this conversation because I think the best thing is putting words to what we're all seeing, and we are all confused. And to kind of go full circle with where we started, like I'm totally reacting against my parents in many ways. Not my parents did a great job with me. I
right,
love my
right.
parents,
You're not a
but
rebel.
no, I'm not rebelling. But
No.
there's some things where I'm like, I would have liked some more structure in my teenage years,
Yeah.
and I'm finding that here in the Catholic Church. And my dad, he lived in like Costa Mesa, California. He hated the TBN Pentecostal televangelist thing. He wanted to go out to the country and live on a farm with these ascetic Hutterites
Yep.
and do that. And so, like, who knows what my kids are going to be reacting against when they grow up. I hope they stay Catholic, but I have limited control over that, and I have limited control over the world that they're going to be living in. And man, I'm keeping my kids away from AI as long as I possibly can. I'll tell you that.
Well, that's wise, and I would limit the screens, and I would, give them the best education that you and your wife can possibly give them. And because whatever way they go and whatever world they have to engage, yeah, giving them a human upbringing will help them and form them to make the best decisions that they have to make when they're your age. So
Amen. Well, I want to. I hope that they will want to take care of me and that I don't have to go live in an old folks' home.
I
So,
think they will. I think I suspect you and your wife are good parents, and generally speaking, kids will recognize that and they'll love you even if they disagree with you, just like you love your parents, even if you disagree with them.
amen. Well, thank you so much for having me on, Paul. This
Oh,
was
Sam, this was fun.
stimulating.
All right. You take care. I just be prepared. I bet you some other people are going to want to reach out to you and further the conversation.
Well, I love these conversations, and I'm going to keep watching your videos, and I look forward to more.
All right. Thanks,
All
Sam.
right. See you,
Take
Paul.
care. Bye bye.
Bye.